Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the New Mexico Black Lawyers Association's virtual Social Justice 101 Lunch and Learn. My name is Asia Brooks, and I am the president of the New Mexico Black Lawyers Association. First of all, I'd like to thank the City of Albuquerque's Office of Civil Rights for co-sponsoring this event. This would not have been possible without your help. I would also like to thank the members of the Executive Board of the New Mexico Black Lawyers Association, Professor Sonia Gibson-Rankin, Professor Vinay Harpalani, Tori Jacobus, and Dominique Oliver for all of the hard work that you have put into making these sessions happen. Secondly, I'd like to go over some virtual housekeeping. We will be recording these sessions. The chat function has been disabled, and the only video will be of the presenters and the moderators. However, we will have a question and answer period at the end of the session. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can after the presentation. We do want this to be a safe space for people, and we may be speaking about some sensitive topics, so attendees will only see the answered questions. Today's presentations are approved in New Mexico for 1 hour of general CLE credit per session. That means if you would like to receive credit for both hours, 2 hours total, you must attend both sessions. If you're an attorney or paralegal seeking CLE credit, please make sure to email your name and bar number to us at nmblacklawyers with an S @gmail.com. Again, that's NM as in New Mexico, nmblacklawyers, no spaces, @gmail.com, so that we can ensure that you receive CLE credit. Now, with all of that out of the way, today is our first day of our 3-day lunch and learn. We are so excited to have you here with us. We have 2 topics that our esteemed speakers will be presenting to you today. From now until 12:30, we have Dr. Kathy L. Powers presenting Race, Rights, and Reparations. And from 12:30 to 1:30, we have Dr. Finnie D. Coleman presenting #Black Lives Matter. You will not need to log out between sessions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kathy Powers. Dr. Kathy L. Powers is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of New Mexico. She also holds appointments in the University of New Mexico Program of Africana Studies, the School of Law, and the Center for Social Policy, as well as the Department of Government at Georgetown University. She has been recently named a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C. Her international politics research focuses on the role of institutions and law in trade, human rights, and war. Her recent research specifically focuses on the role of politics and law in reparations efforts for mass atrocities globally and in the United States. Professor Powers has published her research in diverse venues, such as the Diverse Issues in Higher Education, NAACP Special Edition, Transmissions, Journal of Conflict Resolution, the Journal of Peace Research, International Interactions Foreign Policy Analyst, and the Review of International Studies. These accolades and honors go on and on. So thank you, Dr. Powers, for being with us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so can you see the screen? And I'll start the slide presentation. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about race, rights, and reparations, and to focus specifically on the tools of reparations. So I'll start off with briefly talking about reparations under international law, because it matters for some of the strategies that Black lawyers across the country are using in reparations efforts, like reparations for police brutality, and then to move to specific tools like legislative bills. That's the cutting edge of tools for African-American reparations today. And I'll go through and show you some of the cities and states that have in the last 7 to 8 months passed legislative bills for reparations for slavery, police brutality, as well as for housing discrimination and discrimination in loaning. So thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you to the New Mexico Black Lawyers Association and the City Office of Civil Rights for the opportunity to speak. Thank you, Asia, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. I just want to say it's an honor to be here. I hope that I get a chance to learn from you more than anything. So I'll skip past how I was going to talk about myself and the work that I do. To say this again. Hello. To say this in general, I'm an international relations. Hello. International relations scholar within political science who has focused on the role of institutions in law, in trade, human rights, and war. My most recent work is focused on trying to understand why some reparations efforts are sought and awarded and others are not, and the connection between economics and reparations, and the connection between reparations and political violence as well. So the scope of work that I've done in the past has been global studies. More recently, I'm moving to public opinion about reparations, working on a project with Gabe Sanchez and Brooke Abrams from the Center for Social Policy on how do Americans and African Americans think about the issue of reparations for slavery. I'm doing work on reparations and how people feel about it in the aftermath of civil conflict in Syria and refugees flowing into Lebanon. So surveys of Syrians and Lebanese people in Lebanon about reparations, and work on Nepal with co-authors Prakash Adhikari and Wendy L. Hansen. So I've done some other case study work on the Holocaust, CARICOM in the Caribbean, Bosnia, and presently I'm really interested in taking what I've learned from studying cases around the world, which the whole reason I did it was to come back and to try to help figure out how to pursue reparations for the legacy of slavery and 250 years of discrimination since, in my practice as well as in my research and teaching. So these are some of the grant funding sources I've had, some research I've conducted, spaces where I've worked: the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, advising policymakers on reparations policies and treaties, working with Dean Alfred Matheson in the aftermath of the DOJ's investigation of the Albuquerque Police Department on data science issues, the data produced, and consulting universities on how to deal with legacies of the past. And there's the list you see. And then also doing education training workshops focused on restorative justice in organizations and educational institutions. So any work that I do or talk about that's related to reparations, I always dedicate that talk to a former student and his family. That student is now a civil rights attorney in Tucson, Arizona, and he's director of desegregation for the Tucson Public School District. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, Sam, the man with the beard, is Sam Brown. And when I taught at the University of Arizona in 2000, he was a sophomore and a student in my class, and he brought his son to office hours. And he was very interested in taking my international political economy class, but wanted to understand why his Jewish grandmother, Judith Schwimmer, and his African-American grandmother, Jean Lamar Haywood, how those sides of the family had very different reparations experiences. So why did his grandmother, who was a victim of the Holocaust in concentration camps, including Auschwitz, receive reparations for that, but his African-American grandmother nor her entire family was a recognition for slavery and the atrocities that had been committed? So his question was, why did one group get reparations for human rights violations and the other did not? Was a profound question about difference. So is difference just difference, or does it represent inequalities that are happening. And so 20 years ago, his question sent me on an intellectual journey into a whole new area in which I wasn't originally trained, in human rights work and restorative justice, to try to understand why some victims get reparations for human rights violations, why others don't. Why do some institutions and courts award reparations to some groups and not others? And so today, what I'm going to sort of lay out for you is what are reparations and what are the functions of reparations in general, and then to show you the different sorts of actors involved that takes us directly to the African American community. So Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood is a cartoon that my kids watched when they were young, and they're animals that are little kids. They play together and sometimes they hurt each other. And so one of the principles was, you must say you're sorry for what you did that hurt someone else. And implicit in that is apology and recognition. First, recognition that some harm was done. And second, recognizing accountability and apologizing. Political violence and wars have been fought over the question of recognition, over apology, and then around the world. And then the second part of this is to ask, how can you make it better? And this is where reparations as one tool to address human rights violations comes into play. Historically, Western NGOs and governments imposed Western notions of justice around the world. And it was largely reparations in the form of money, until they started interviewing and doing surveys of victims who said, I need healthcare as opposed to money. I need healthcare for the rest of my life, because what was done to me will have a permanent effect on me and impact my ability to provide for my family. That it can impact educational institutions, the ability to go to school, the ability to learn. And so there's a norm that has emerged to ask people what would constitute justice in their cultural context, and to start to think more creatively about what can be reparations. And so a class of people have emerged, I call them the reparations entrepreneurs, who've come up with some really interesting ways to appropriately design reparations in order to fit specific harms. And I'll give you some examples along the way. So let's just start with, what are reparations and what have they historically been considered to be? In international relations, it wasn't about human rights and justice. It's called victor's justice. It was about punishment. It was about fines exacted among states, usually for damages incurred during war. So the victor state forced the defeated state to pay reparations as punishment for war damages and for war participation. So think Germany, World War I, World War II, and Japan at the end of World War II. So now it's expanded globally to include a norm of reparations being used to address human rights issues. And let me be clear, reparations being used to address human rights violations has always existed across all religions, cultures, civilizations, legal context. But what is new in the 1990s with the rise of a social movement called transitional justice, to use war crimes tribunals, truth commissions, reparations programs, institutional reform as a way to address widespread, systematic, mass human rights violations like genocide, torture, sexual violence, and other kinds of human rights violations, and slavery as well. So reparations are often demanded in post-dictatorships, post-conflict societies, and cases of unresolved historical justices. In the aftermath of war, it is now boilerplate that peace treaties have reparations provisions in them to deal with the atrocities that happened during the conflict. That trade agreements also have reparations agreements in them. and also for civil cases involving war crimes and other human rights violations. With respect to African American reparations in particular, many of the efforts, and there are many of them below the level of the state, are seeking reparations to address the legacy of slavery, the harms of slavery that have perpetuated through the history of this country, the Black-white wealth gap, for example, police brutality, discrimination in housing and lending, for example, and also for economic development. Okay. So what are the functions of reparations today? The United Nations in 2005, with the rise of reparations efforts around the world to deal with mass human rights violations, took all of the different ways that reparations were used and called them functions of reparations, and have included them in this list. So restitution, to restore what was lost. So for example, if someone's vote was taken away, to restore that, land taken away, restore that, whatever was taken away, to give it back. In the West, especially the United States, the most common form of reparations is compensation, especially for that which is difficult, cannot be restored, that may have some economically accessible damage attached to it. So for example, loss of life, loss of property, for example, and most reparations efforts have both of those components. Rehabilitation is the cutting edge of reparations today, to rehabilitate victims physically and mentally impacted by human rights violations. So for example, in Sierra Leone, people were victims of the rebel groups who would cut off their hands and their feet so that they couldn't walk, work, or vote. And so reparations in that context was prosthetics, or access to medical care for a lifetime of care for being psychologically impacted. So for instance, women in the Congo have been repeatedly victims of sexual violence. And so for a good chunk of their lives, unfortunately. So reparations being considered includes access to medical care physically and medical care psychologically. And satisfaction is giving victims voice. So a truth commission could be a form of reparations. To find the bones of the disappeared can be a form of reparations to victim groups. And then finally, non-repetition, which is the promise that this will never happen again. So at the end of World War II, Germany promised to never repeat the Holocaust. Okay, I have some other functions of reparations that I designed in my research I can talk about in question and answer, but I'll keep moving. So what can perform as reparations? What can be reparations? And so what I've seen in my research, it can be money, it can be in kind. So for example, in World War II, when Germany had no more money to pay, its manufacturing plants that were used in the military industrial complex were broken down brick by brick, put on ships and sent to the United States. And then those factories were then rebuilt. Coal, steel, for example, can be a form of reparations. One of the things that's lost in history is that people have been used as reparations. So in the end of World War II, when Germany had nothing left to pay the Allies, and the emerging Soviet Union felt that it had been impacted, harmed more than anyone else by German aggression, it demanded people. So members of the Nazi military who were sent to Siberia and put in work camps, many of whom never made it back to Germany. Prosthetics, as I've talked about, healthcare, as I've talked about, memorials can be seen as reparation, education in the sense of rebuilding schools that might be destroyed in political violence, or human rights victims whose educational opportunities have been affected. So for instance, the Chicago police torture case in which men were mostly African-American, were incarcerated in torture centers on the west side and the south side of Chicago. This went on from 1972 to 1971 to 1992. And so recognizing that generations of men's ability and opportunity to be educated have been impacted. They had free opportunities now to go to vocational schools and community colleges, but then also to use textbooks as a way to preserve the memory of what happened so that we don't forget and we don't repeat. So also in this case, the textbooks used in the Chicago public school system are being rewritten to include the history of this case. And then also broader economic development. And so reparations can be direct payments or direct things to individuals, or it can be money, resources, opportunities to groups, to countries, to regions that would then lend towards economic development. So figure one that I have here is just to give you an idea of, I have mapped out a global system of reparations seeking and reparations, tools and venues. And so who seeks reparations and also who can be a target of reparations? So individuals, families, groups, states, meaning countries and the states within those countries, international organizations, NGOs, corporations. So just to give you an example, back to states, President Trump has called for reparations from China for being the source of the COVID-19 virus, and is trying to bring a claim against the US government, brings a claim against the Chinese government to seek reparations for the economic costs. The states of Mississippi and Missouri have recently launched separate claims against the Chinese government. So it's just to show you that reparations claims can have different sorts of actors who bring reparations claims and are the targets. So there's this system of reparations mechanisms. Okay, so reparations can be pursued through a legal claim in court, in international courts like human rights commissions, like the European Court for Human Rights, the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, at the national level and at the domestic level. And so lawyers around the world are venue shopping and trying to figure out, is very difficult to do claims simultaneously in multiple venues, especially because even international venues have discretion as to whether or not they'll take the claim. And so, but the field is bigger to bring it to domestic courts at local levels, state levels, national levels, and then to go internationally. Legislation, reparations can be sued through laws. So for example, local, state, national laws, like HR 40 is being pursued originally by John Conyers and then later by, excuse me, I'm sorry. And also the reparations ordinance that was passed by the Chicago City Council is an example of a reparations bill. The latter half of my presentation is going to focus here because the cutting edge of reparations mechanisms used today in the United States is reparations bills, either at the city level, the state level, or the national level. Public policies are another popular mechanism for seeking reparations across the planet. And so, for instance, the Czech Republic's government created a public policy to give or award reparations to the Roma who had suffered in Nazi camps during the Holocaust, but weren't part of the main narrative, so didn't receive reparations. Those reparations are considered controversial. They are household goods that were given to people that had no input, didn't know that they were going to receive reparations, and the kind of reparations was based on stereotypes about them. So public policies as a mechanism of reparations, as well as legislation, have diffused across the planet and diffused across the United States at all levels of government. It is little known that we have a system of reparations treaties. So treaties are the hard law, primary form of international law that is used between states to determine reparations in the aftermath of mass human rights violations and usually attached to conflict. So for example, the United States and France in 2014 signed a reparations agreement in which France, the government had allowed trains owned by corporations to take Holocaust victims to concentration camps. Some of those victims and or their families are in the United States. So France paid the United States $60 million to then distribute to these individuals. And in fact, what's really innovative about this is that the Jewish community demanded, when President Clinton came into office, a high-level office in the US State Department called the Office of Holocaust Issues, whose job it is to negotiate reparations related to the Holocaust in the name of American citizens around the world. And so this is to show you, one, that new reparations efforts are still going on, the creativity in demanding a mechanism after contributing heavily to his presidential campaign, representation in an office in the State Department, and a way to seek reparations from countries who did not fully recognize their accountability nor provide some form of redress for it. And then finally, international organizations have resolutions and they have departments dedicated to reparations. So for example, the International Organization for Migration that deals with people who are displaced across national boundaries has a reparations unit. The International Criminal Court has a victims trust fund that awards reparations to victims who are willing to testify in war crimes cases in the International Criminal Court. Was little known a couple months ago in the United Nations. So first of all, a couple years ago, under the President Trump administration, the United States withdrew from the United Nations Human Rights Council, which opened it up for lots to happen. And in the aftermath of the George Floyd murders, there are 47 member countries of the United Nations Human Rights Council. The Africa group came together and presented a resolution that demanded that the United Nations create a truth commission to study the role of law enforcement and its human rights violations towards people of African descent. That's the language that was used in the resolution, and to consider reparations. So most African Americans don't know that African countries were advocating for us in the United Nations Human Rights Council, heavily impacted and influenced by George Floyd's murder. Right now in Nigeria, there are mass protests across the country because of issues of police brutality. So figure 3 is to show you, just give you an example of what a reparations public policy looks like. And it's become boilerplate that reparations portfolios or public policy, so a country passes legislation that funds a public policy that gives reparations or awards reparations to a large number of people, sometimes in the hundreds of thousands, because to bring those individual legal claims would congest courts across countries. So they use the public policy as a different mechanism for a large amount of people. And they usually look like this. Part of it is monetary compensation, part is educational benefits, and part is medical care. And you can see these reparations public policies across Latin America, Africa, and Central Europe. Heavily influenced by this, and we'll talk about it more, lawyers in police brutality cases are using this model, and this is the exact model that was used in the Chicago police torture case, who was influenced by the claims in Chile, Argentina, South Africa, that the acts of the police officers constituted torture under the Convention on Torture. So in many of these cases, they're no longer saying that individual civil rights are being violated. They're saying that their human rights are being violated. So they can invoke international law like the Convention on Torture and also precedents in other countries who have seen these actions as torture and then therefore worthy of redress in the form of reparations. Okay, how am I doing? Okay, so that's the international part of this. And now I'm going to move to the African American reparations movement. If I don't talk about ADOS, the American descendants of the South, please remind me, because I want to come back to them because they problematize and the term African American in terms of who should get reparations and who shouldn't within the community. Historically, in COBRA, Black Lives Matter, the Reparations Coordination Committee, all organizations that have advocated for reparations in the United States included people in the United States of African descent. And so ADOS's definition is a departure, which we'll talk about. So something to understand about African American reparations, and part of the reason why I did the international cases and work was to try to understand the place of our reparations efforts globally, and maybe to get some ideas about how we might be creative in pursuing reparations. And in that process, I realized the positionality of the African American reparations movement. It is one of the oldest on the planet. There are remnants in the 17th and 18th centuries, 17 and 1800s, discourse, literature, and efforts for reparations for slavery. It is global, local, and historical. And so it represents as a historical injustice. So much of reparations today is about the current past. So 25 years out, 50 years out, 100 years out. But for cases that are hundreds of years and layers of human rights violations that are interacting and multidimensional, thank you, and multidimensional. It is an important case. And also to recognize that and remember that the United States is one of the most powerful countries in the world. It is a permanent member of the Security Council with veto power. So it is incredibly difficult to bring a human rights violations case against the government within the United States and also abroad. African Americans also do not have control the state, as an apparatus for seeking reparations globally as Caribbean countries and African countries do. It's a cautionary tale of 200 years of layers of human rights violations and systematic police brutality over the course of the presence of African Americans in America. So it is systematic, continuous from the time that police gangs rounded up freed slaves, escaped enslaved Africans, and people who were free and took them to the South and enslaved them. That relationship, that targeting between the African American community and the police starts with slavery and continues till today and should be understood in that context. So what does the network of African American reparations efforts kind of look like? There's the effort towards national legislation. Professor William Darity at Duke University is leading a group right now to write white papers to advise Congress on a national level reparations bill and policy making. States and cities have reparations bills, their domestic legal claims, corporate claims, which I can talk about in more detail, community organizations, universities confronting their past about the legacies of slavery like Georgetown, and laws and ordinances. So I'm going to talk just a little bit in my last 15 minutes about the reparations bills that have started, largely influenced by a reparations debate, one that was part of the presidential elections. We need to remember that the last time reparations for African Americans for slavery was part of legitimate discourse in a presidential election was during the Reconstruction period. And so it really started with Democratic candidates being challenged on whether or not they support reparations and what that might look like. And then on top of that, you have the police killing of George Floyd that started a protest movement, not only across the United States, but then across the planet in support of African Americans and also for human rights violations that were happening in particular countries abroad. And so reparations bills at the level of cities started to be discussed and passed across the country. So this is a picture of DC Ward 5 Councilman or Council Member Kenyon McDuffie, who has been a key advocate of a reparations bill for Washington, DC, and has advocated. He started in 2015 and has been instrumental in passing a reparations commission establishment act that is designed to create a commission to study the legacy of slavery and the legacy of human rights violations towards African Americans in DC. This is a picture of Mayor Jorge Elorza. He is the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, and so which has also passed a reparations bill. And this is sort of to show you the diverse group of people who are involved in making this happen in Providence, Rhode Island. So we've talked about like sort of cities, individuals who've advocated for it, and these two individuals have advocated for a reparations bill, HR 40, at the national level. Representative John Conyers, thank you. Representative John Conyers originally proposed the bill in 1989, and every single year in Congress for the next 30 years, although it never was voted upon for discussion in Congress. And Congresswoman Sheila Jackson took up the mantle and brought HR 40 back to a congressional session in 2019 and 2020. It was approved and congressional hearings followed. So I think what we should understand is the African American reparations effort for slavery and the layers of human rights violations since is long. In many ways, it is simultaneous to and precedes reparations efforts for systematic mass human rights violations globally. So they're existing in parallel while victims around the world are going to international entities like courts and through treaties to get reparations. African Americans have gone the opposite direction, more and more locally, from the national level to the state level to the city level, given one, the lack of success in pursuing national level reparations in the past, and also the recognition of the United States role on the UN Security Council and its power. And I've had a chance to talk to lawyers on some of these cases, and I've said, well, you can bring a case against the US government and the Inter-American Court for Human Rights for reparations. And they say, but what would an international judgment mean against a member of the Security Council who has veto power if they choose not to comply with an international judgment? So this is just an example of what reparations bills look like at the city level. So we've heard about Asheville, North Carolina, Evanston, Illinois, Providence, Rhode Island, who have each passed reparations bills, and I have the names in the second column. In the third, the dates that they were actually passed, the purpose of the bill across them all to recognize the legacy of harms from slavery until now, as well as the layers of other human rights violations during Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, red line districting, redistricting. I can go on and on, police brutality, about the levels of harms. And so all of these bills are designed not only to address the past, but the present, and to figure out how to change the effects of those harms or remove them going forward. What's interesting about Providence, Rhode Island is that it's establishing a truth commission that deals with a report, an investigation of the truth of what happened, how to facilitate reconciliation among Providence, Rhode Island residents in terms of the legacy and impact of this history, and then also reparations to African Americans. And I want to highlight in each one of these, they say African Americans. What makes Evanston, Illinois very innovative is the funding mechanism for this reparations bill is taxes on the recreational use of marijuana as a way to fund it, as opposed to general taxes from the population. This slide is to give you an idea of the efforts at the state level and reparations discussions that are happening, reparations laws that are being passed in Vermont, New York, California, and Texas. So what I'm trying to show you is that there are layers of reparations laws that have been passed or in the last year, last 8 months that are happening at the city level, the state level, and at the national level. And so examples of advocates of state level reparations legislation include California State Representative Shirley Weber and Pennsylvania State Representative Chris Rabb. So they have passed, their states have passed reparations bills for reparations for slavery and subsequent human rights violations towards the African American community. So just to give you an example of what some of these state level bills look like, California, New York, Vermont, all recognize the legacy of slavery, all address subsequent harms. Vermont includes an apology for what was done and recognizing the impact of the institutionalization of slavery. California proposes a truth commission to do fact finding and then to propose reparations. Okay, so I'm just gonna, I can't believe I actually finished early, so I'm just gonna say this really quickly, is that I think what lawyers in our community have to offer is the tool of law to come up with innovative ways to address mass human rights violations in our community from slavery to the present in innovative ways, using law, using policy, considering ways to get access to institutions in the government. For example, having an office in the US State Department may or may not make sense, but maybe having an office dedicated in the US government to these issues, might be a form of institutional innovation. And so innovation in many of these cases starts with the lawyers in the community. So you are incredibly important in the recognition of this legacy of human rights violations and being creative and thinking about what are particular harms and creative ways to construct reparations to address it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powers. Please join me in giving her a warm round of applause. Dr. Powers, we have 2 questions for you, and I will be moderating the questions. You should be able to see it on your screen, but our first question comes from Bruce Thompson. I really appreciate the definition of apology to include both sincere expression of remorse and an agreement to correct or compensate all the harm. This is fundamental in the U.S. tort system, but number 2 is often downplayed or ignored. The institutional or corporate defendant inevitably says, we're really sorry about what we did, but please award the plaintiff a nominal amount, or please award their medical expenses only. This mindset is entrenched in our political representatives too. Even if a political representative is receptive to the idea of reparations, the notion of redressing the entire harm goes nowhere. How do we persuade policymakers, political representatives that all 5 components of reparations are necessary? Restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and non-repetition. Great question.
Oh, it's awesome. Thank you so much for it. And I think it is demanding when people run for office that that this be included in reparations public policies that are formed at the level of the local, state, and national governments. I think one tool that we have is our vote. Another is to begin contributing to political campaigns at a large scale. And watching the Jewish community, this was within the United States. This was a key tool to be able to then demand reparations and then what they look like and their functions. And so they contributed to presidential campaigns, state level campaigns. They demanded offices within the government. And so I think two tools that immediately come to mind are voting and contributing to national campaigns. Also, third would be to run for office, so that then we can design these mechanisms to include all, because you're absolutely right. Most of the time, they don't include the 5 components. And in fact, in most reparations cases, what is dealt with first is property rights and harm in that way. Was your business destroyed by the government? Was your livestock taken away, as in Nepal? And that gets reparations first because it's more easily economically accessible, but we also prioritize property rights over human rights. The burden to prove that the integrity of the body has been impacted and that is impacting and that is important is much greater than for any kind of harm done for property rights, and that's global.
Dr. Powers, we've got a couple of great more questions. Are there reparations efforts underway for Native Americans in the United States? For instance, in California, there were bounties for Native Americans' body parts up through the late 19th century. I didn't see this mentioned in the California bill.
Yes, there have been. So first of all, what makes Native American reparations complicated is that there's over 500 tribes, and they all have different cultural notions of what constitutes justice. And so they are pursuing different kinds of reparations in different kinds of venues. So there have been cases in California courts. And in fact, Professor Les Field in the anthropology department consulted Native American tribes in California on bringing reparations land claims for land that had been taken away. UNM, I think the world needs to know about this, has been addressing multi-ethnic legacies of human rights violations, including stolen totem poles by Professor Hibben in the anthropology department, and has negotiated, for instance, with a British Columbian tribe. Culturally, they said we can't accept the totem pole back because it is tainted. We want a replica made. We want the original restored and a ceremony done to cleanse it. They flew leaders here, did that, sent that original to the family, and then created a replica that we have that we can keep until they demand it back. So that's an example of a cultural form of reparations that UNM is involved in.
Dr. Powers, we have a couple more questions. Given the racial disparities that we see in personal wealth as a result of our history of oppression in this country, do you think personal reparations should also happen? What could or would that look like?
That's a great question. I think there should be layers of reparations. And I think that individuals and institutions in the African American community should receive reparations. But what I argue is that reparations can be lots of different things. So for example, and I think actually Dean Alfred Matheson is the one working on this, is to think about reducing tax liabilities as a form of reparations, for example, to have preferential house loans for housing. I think it's Evanston, Illinois also has loans for entrepreneurs. And so to think about not just individuals, but categories of individuals, I think historically Black colleges in our community should also receive reparations as important institutions in our communities, many of whom were impacted by slavery because so many of us couldn't go to other kinds of colleges, went to historically Black colleges, but allowed us to study ourselves, to pursue politics as a political venue. So I think historically Black colleges and Black churches are institutions in the community that should receive institutional level reparations for economic development.
Dr. Powers, we have another question. Are the cities that are listed the only cities that have passed reparation litigation?
No, those are just examples, but I would add Washington, D.C. I didn't get a chance to talk about Durham, North Carolina. So there are a host of cities that are either have passed them or are considering them. There's also a different set of reparations laws that precede these bills that I didn't even get a chance to talk about, where cities like Chicago, Cincinnati, LA, I think Cleveland was considering it, had reparations city ordinances that said, if corporations want city contracts, they have to do an investigation into their history and their connection to slavery as a truth-telling mechanism, since we couldn't get HR 40 passed, which then led to these individual companies, when they connected their legacies or their histories to slavery, passed or awarded reparations on their own. So there's layers, like there's these reparations bills today, but there's a history of reparations ordinances that require truth-telling.
And we've got another question. One of our speakers would love for us to circle back to the African descendants of enslaved persons. Can you expand a little bit on that issue?
I sure can. I apologize. I didn't talk about this because it's incredibly important for the African American reparations debate today. So the American descendants of the South are a group who have been able to seize control over the narrative of reparations for African Americans and have defined it as such. It should be for the legacy of slavery and the creation of the Black-white wealth gap. And so this group, probably the academic that is most representative of this is Professor William Darity at Duke University. But what they've also said is, they argue that the experience of Black Americans, so they've introduced a new identity and term, is different from people who are of African descent, who are immigrants from their perspective chose to come here. So Black Americans' experience should be seen as a different ethnic group who were enslaved and whose families for generations were impacted. The definition is, and so they took control over defining who's included and who isn't. And the definition is at least one parent who is a descendant of an enslaved African. And so it has sparked controversy. This started about a year and a half ago in the major cities, LA, DC, New York, Chicago. If you want to follow the discussion, is hashtag ADOS. And it's an important one because their way of defining who gets reparations and for what is shaping the national conversation today. So in fact, the California reparations bill says very specifically, reparations for slavery, for broader human rights violations, for African Americans, and then people specifically of descent of enslaved Africans. So it's one of the few that is inclusive and distinguishing at the same time. So to give you an example, Nikki Giovanni was interviewed and she said, I no longer refer to myself as African American, I say Black American because of the legacy of slavery, for example. There are critics of ADOS that say that people in the African American community that don't have this heritage have suffered generations of human rights violations and discrimination and police brutality in the United States. So why are they being separated? And so it is one to watch, and it is an example to go back to the question of like, how do we have an impact? Is that ADOS has started a social movement within the African American reparations social movement to define a particular group if they felt that you can't go for everyone, then we'll start here. The Reparations Coordination Committee did the same thing. Johnny Cochran, Charles Ogletree, and other civil rights attorneys, including the leader of NCOBRA, got together and said, we can't go for them all. So we're going to decide which cases have the best chance in court, like Tulsa, Oklahoma. So they positioned themselves as a selection mechanism and created their own criteria. Most African Americans didn't even know it, to decide the strongest case that could go to courts.
I think that's wonderful. Dr. Powers, we're running short on time, but one more question. Criminal justice reform, how are we seeing any of that play out in reparations bills?
Oh, okay. So the way that I've seen it so far is specifically talking about the relationship between the African American community and the police, and to focus on police excessive use of force specifically, one, and second, the movement to defund the police as a form of reparations. And so I think that there are going to be calls for reparations, specifically more broadly about mass incarceration. And so, for example, the argument in Chicago is you cannot understand mass incarceration in Chicago of African Americans, especially African American men, if you don't understand the broad-ranging evolutionary impact of Chicago police torture by John Berg, a police detective for 20 years. And so there are these linkages between mass incarceration now being made in police brutality.
Dr. Powers, just to sum it up, and then I'll turn it back over to our Madam President, Asia Brooks. We're looking at a very divided nation in this time. How are reparations going to be addressed going forward? Can anything be done on this reparations question to address the very divided nature we've watched this past year?
I think that's
several years.
Several years. I think it will, not impossible, be difficult to pursue a reparations bill at the national level, but the action will be in the cities. And that's already happening. And so I think that we have to look at the other venues within which we can pursue reparations, understanding what's happening in national politics. There are already close to 10, maybe more cities who've passed reparations bills in the last 6 to 7 months, and there's more to come. So I think because there's such division nationally, the cities are where the action is going to be going forward, at least in the current present. So thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Powers. This is so interesting. We're so glad that you were able to join us. And we appreciate your time. So thank you for joining us. We're going to start our next session with Dr. Coleman. But before I introduce him, I do want to say, I know that we had a few people who had some trouble connecting to the Zoom link. If you are joining for the next 3 days, and I know some of you are joining for more than one day, please make sure you check your junk mail or your spam mail for the links to join. They are separate links for every day. So the link that you use today will not work for tomorrow, nor will that link work for Friday. So the email that you were sent, if you were sent a 3-day link, we'll have separate links for each day. So make sure you check your spam folder if you had issues joining today, and hopefully you will see the email with the 3 separate links for each day to join. If you do not see that email for whatever reason and you still need those links, let us know via our nmblacklawyers@gmail.com email address. So our apologies. Thank you so much for your patience with this, but we will move on into our next presentation. So our next presentation, we have Dr. Finnie D. Coleman presenting #Black Lives Matter. And Dr. Finnie Coleman is the president of the Faculty Senate at the University of New Mexico, where he teaches courses in American literature, African American literature, and African American cultural history. He has taught a wide range of courses ranging from graduate seminars on Mark Twain and undergraduate and graduate courses on hip hop culture, Afrofuturism, and Black Lives Matter. All of his courses introduce students to the manifold functions of culture and shifting definitions of race at critical moments in American history. Committed to higher education and development of our youth, Dr. Coleman chairs the governing council for Albuquerque's newly opened ACES Tech Charter School. He has served on the governing board at Amy Beale High School and coaches and referees Little League Soccer. Prior to his career in academia, Dr. Coleman served in the Persian Gulf and Germany as an Army intelligence officer. He is a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute and earned his MA and PhD degrees in English from the University of Virginia. Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman, for being with us, and I am going to turn it over to you. Oh, you are muted still.
Thank you for this opportunity. I have the unenviable task of following Dr. Kathy Powers. I hope that you all enjoyed her presentation as much as I did. There's a great deal of power in her presentation. I work with Dr. Powers from time to time, and also with my colleague Nancy Lopez on these types of presentations. So it's always exciting to hear what Dr. Powers has to say. I need to thank my colleague, Sonia Gibson-Rankin, who is always looking out and has been a remarkable colleague and friend. And I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to speak today. I have a presentation for you. I'll put that up here. I'll share screen with you. That should be on your screens now. All right. All righty. So my presentation today is about Black Lives Matter, this movement, this tradition of resistance in African American cultural history. And I wanted to give a little bit of the background for Black Lives Matter in terms of those resistance movements. And I'll say a little bit about that history, and then move on to what I think is a really interesting point of origin for the Black Lives Matter movement and how it came to be organized the way that it has become organized. The resistance movements in Black America and Black history, range from the work that was done during, slavery to abolish slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, all of those things that you see listed there. And one of the things that gets lost sometimes when we talk about Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, is the long tradition of that resistance. That from day one, Black people in the Americas, not just in the United States, but all across the Americas, resisted slavery, and then found themselves battling to be included in American society. For some of you, you will know the work of Charles Mills and his notion that we have been essentially imagining our country to have a social contract rooted in liberal democracy, when in truth, we've really had a racial contract where the democracy that we set up wasn't set up for all people to benefit from. In fact, the only group in this country that can lay claim to being part of a social contract in America rooted in liberal democracy has to be white men who were propertied, and we index that to who has had the right to vote. The franchise is the marker for whether or not you are participating in that social contract. And so our entire history has been about getting our nation to revise that initial contract, to move away from the racial contract that we have lived under in our country's history. And Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement has an interesting, I think, trajectory and timing in American history that we are starting to rethink and reimagine what it means to be an American, what it means to be Black in America. There are some trenchant ideas out there that we have been battling against through the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, Operation Push, Rainbow Coalition, all of these different movements to get us to this moment where we are at present. For several years now, I've been teaching a Black Lives Matter course at UNM. And that course started off with this notion of the public image of Blackness, and then with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. I've used the same chassis to create courses that focus on hip hop culture. And then this fall, I've been teaching this course that has been a fascinating course. And, you know, kind of an aside, if you are unfamiliar with what's going on in Afrofuturism, I highly encourage you to have a look at what's going on with Lovecraft Country, what's happening with, if you haven't had a chance to see The Boys, to see what's happening in Watchmen, that series on HBO. It's a remarkable moment in African American cultural history, and I'm really proud to have a chance to be teaching about these about this cultural production in our own moment. All of this will culminate this semester with a session on Black Lives Matter, and we'll focus on George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor for the last couple of weeks in my course here. And as I was preparing my comments today, I kept, whenever I'd want to type Breonna Taylor, I kept going back to, for some reason, Rekia Boyd's image kept popping in my head. And it made me realize that we need to stop and focus. We tend to focus almost exclusively on the young Black men who we've lost in this period, this Black Lives Matter movement, and how we focused on young Black men. But many young Black women have also been victims to police violence, to violence in our communities. And I wanted to pause because I realized that much of my presentation today is going to center around the young Black men. But Rekia Boyd, that image of her, that smile, just it's hard to not feel some sense of sorrow when you look at the face of this young woman and how we lost her way too early. All right. I also noticed as I've gone through this that there's some interesting similarities across different moments in this movement and resonances with the past. And what that suggests to me is that we are actually going in these kinds of circles where we're revisiting the past, but there's something different about the energy in this Black Lives Matter movement that I hope I can touch on a little bit today. This is the race riots that happened in 1964. A horrible race riot. Some of us will remember as we study, the civil rights movement, that, in August of 2014, a police officer shot and killed 15-year-old James Powell in Harlem, New York. And those riots were 50 days or 50 years to the day in Ferguson that you see on the left. Those riots took place 50 years to the day that James Powell was killed in Harlem. And like Mike Brown, his body was left in the streets. And it just, the similarities are just eerie to me. When we talk about Black Lives Matter, we typically begin with Trayvon Martin, who was killed by George Zimmerman on the 27th of February 2012. But we should remember that Trayvon was one of 3 Black youths killed in Florida within about a 2-year period. And in each case, the shooters attempted to use stand your ground laws to for their defense. We'll remember Jordan Davis, his shooting in November 2012, but we may not have even heard about the murder of Gutierrez Lopez Benjamin that happened near my hometown in Jay, Florida, where this young man, not this young man, the young man that you see on the screen right now is Jordan Davis, who was killed at a gas station because he was playing his music too loud. And but Gutierrez Lopez case went unnoticed in the national news. He had gone to a party with some friends, and they wound up at a party that was supposedly only for white people. Got into an altercation, were told to leave, and as they left, a young man fired his rifle 5 times into the back of their vehicle and killed Gutierrez. Gus was his nickname. And for me, I used to run track in Northwest Florida. This kid was a track star in Northwest Florida, and just losing him and losing Jordan Davis, and then having people be able to use the law to defend themselves. These laws, of course, came about. The proliferation of these laws with the so-called "Make My Day" laws in the 1980s. Currently, as you can see from the slide, there are 25 states that have some version of stand your ground laws where there's no obligation to retreat from an attacker. Benjamin, Martin, and Davis were all unarmed when they were killed. The Black Lives Matter movement began on the 14th of July, 2013, the day after George Zimmerman was acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin. The movement is just over 7 years old, but has become a powerful agent of change in American society. And even though its popularity is waning among white Americans, that power was on full display during this past election cycle. In the 7 years of its existence, 7.5 years of its existence, Black Lives Matter activists have staged thousands of protests in the United States and around the world. And I had some maps. I'll skip over that. I have some maps that I might have shown you of these different protests around the world. Better than 4,000 in the United States, and then hundreds, if not thousands, more protests in Europe and around the world. Today, I want to discuss the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and briefly discuss what I see as 4 distinct stages in the movement's development. But before I do that, I want to briefly explain the roots of how the movement is organized and why it's organized the way that it is. And to understand how Black Lives Matter works, the decentered leadership, the reliance on social media, youth focus, and mistrust of established leaders and methodologies, we have to go to a small town in Tunisia. On the 18th of December 2010, a 26-year-old fruit and vegetable vendor, Mohamed Tarek Bouassisi, who you see here on the left-hand side, took his own life in the streets of Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia. His kind of Tibetan-esque protest against police brutality and widespread corruption led to the near immediate downfall of Tunisian President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Ben Ali was a man who had held power since leading the Tunisian Revolution, or what they call the medical coup d'etat of November of 1987. It is difficult to believe that this powerful dictator fell as the result of a single act by one frustrated and humiliated fruit vendor. And that's probably because um, the supposed cause and effect relationship between Bouazizi's suicide and the collapse of Ali's regime is not altogether accurate. So when Ali fled Tunisia in January of 2011, people around the world were given a powerful example of how an individual act committed in pursuit of justice can literally change the world, but only if the conditions are right for that change. And so while Bouaziz's immolation was certainly a catalyst in Ali's downfall, it wasn't the actual cause of the larger movement. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about that, the Arab Spring. I know it, for some of us, it may seem it's a little bit off topic, but I want to spend some time there because the Black Lives Matter movement, there were moments during the movement when people from the Arab Spring were actually calling in to places like Ferguson, and some of you may have seen the documentary on Black Lives Matter, the 2016 documentary, where folk from Egypt were telling the protests how to use milk and things like that to get rid of the pain from the tear gas that they were being gassed with. So following his death, members of Bouazizi's family and some of his close friends held a small protest that was in open defiance of the laws that were put in place to curb public demonstrations. And knowing that they faced beatings and worse, this small group found the courage to stand against Ben Ali's tyranny in spite of the potential consequences. So in truth, it was the success of that small protest, the defiant protest following Bouazizi's immolation, that sparked the Arab Spring, not the ritual sacrifice in and of itself. Absent the risk taken by his family and friends in the days following his death, and then Hosni Kalaya's decision to also immolate himself 3 weeks after Bouazizi, it's likely that we would not have known about, the Arab Spring would not have taken off. There are 145 immolations like that, and just in China's Sichuan province at the time that Bouazizi committed this act, just from 2009 to 2011. So it's likely we would not have heard about Bouazizi's immolation. But his sacrifice and the small protests that followed tapped into a deep and long festering feelings of anger and unrest. Tunis Al-Manar, a university psychologist at Muanu Sayadini, described the chaos in a way that I describe the chaos here with Black Lives Matter, that it's a dialectic of conflict and appeasement that kind of highlights a process of making, unmaking, and remaking that was driven by an intense ongoing struggle between emergent social forces and established political formations. So country after country entered that cycle. We'll know that after Tahrir Square, we saw Mubarak fall, Saleh resigned, Gaddafi was killed. And this is a timeline of the Arab Spring. And you can see that it overlaps with some of the events that I've mentioned, especially the killing of Gaitran in or Gus in Pace, Florida. Something was different after Tahrir Square. The blueprint for social upheaval had changed. Political protests and civil unrest across the Arab world quickly spread to other parts of the planet. Egypt's President Mubarak resigned office just 4 weeks after Ben Ali fled Tunisia for Saudi Arabia. In March of that year, the Syrian Civil War was sparked by protests in Dara, and President Bashar Assad is still in place, but they were trying to oust him. 6 months after Ali fled Tunisia, Gaddafi was also on the run, and he was killed in October of 2011. So it was not surprising that following Gaddafi's death, that Yemeni President Abdullah Saleh also agreed to give up power. Let's see. Sorry about that. So after Tahrir Square, we saw that movement come to the United States in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And it was there that we started to see the codification of the method that Black Lives Matter uses. In Tahrir Square, there was some fear that if they had an individual leader, that leader would be struck down. And that decentralized leadership was what allowed those protests to move and shift from place to place without any individual leader being taken out, if you will. The reliance on social media, all of that was important as well. And the thing that I've said before is that you needed a particular type of energy for these movements to actually succeed. You know, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, started, of course, in Zuccotti Park in September of the year during the Arab Spring. Zuccotti Park was formerly called Liberty Square in New York City, and members of the business community, political leaders, and everyday citizens were almost evenly split over the movement. Some commentators blasted the leaders of the Occupy Wall Street movement as being disorganized, opportunistic degenerates, while others like Ron Paul, who was a presidential candidate at the time, openly praised the Occupy movement and put it on par philosophically with the then emerging Tea Party. And if we wonder why and how Black Lives Matter seems to be conflated with these hate groups that are on the left, then we get some sense of that because it was Ron Paul who brought in that notion of the Occupy movement. Sonia, can you give me a time check, please?
Dr. Coleman, we are at 12:55 right now.
Mm-hmm. And so how much time do I have left there then?
So you have about how much? 15, 20 minutes? Is that
Okay.
right? You started at 12:30.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I need to, all right. So if nothing else, Ron Paul, when he praised the Occupy movement and put it on par with the Tea Party, it made the Occupy Wall Street movement, positioned it in opposition to this far right movement. And when Black Lives Matter came into existence, it wasn't that Black Lives Matter was, to the far left. It was that the Black Lives Matter movement was associated with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was seen as being the obverse, if you will, of the Tea Party. So that movement spread rapidly across the country, spawned numerous secondary Occupy movements. Three of these movements, Occupy Colleges, Occupy Education, and Occupy Education Northern California, joined together with the New York Student Alliance to stage one of the first coordinated nationwide protests by high school and college students during the Day of Action. That was in March 1st of 2012, when students went on strike, staged sit-ins across the country, marched, and otherwise attempted to disrupt business as usual. In my class, I talk about this notion of antinomianism, this healthy skepticism for authority. And the antinomianism that galvanized Bouazizi's family and friends was alive and well in student activists in campuses across the country. And the success of the Day of Action forced a lot of leaders in higher education to take notice of student unrest regarding tuition, quality of education, and faculty compensation, among other things. This nationwide rejection of the status quo in higher education was followed by innumerable sit-ins at local school board meetings, picketing of mayor's offices, protests in front of city halls, demonstrations at the Department of Education, and occupation of college campuses. From Cambridge to Berkeley, college students joined together to protest the rising cost of a college education. And as the movement grew, students, faculty, staff, and administrators began to see more clearly that controlling costs was not just the right thing to do; it was good for business as well. And then, no matter what side you might have taken in the early debates concerning the motivations for the Occupy movement or the efficacy of that platform, you cannot help but marvel at the fact that unprecedented numbers of people from very different walks of life took notice and then took action. That's something that's been unique, if you will. Well, I shouldn't say unique. It's been more pronounced in the Black Lives Matter movement that it's not just Black kids out in the street marching. There are kids from all walks of life, from all ethnic backgrounds, who are joining in this movement as well. So it doesn't matter what side you were on. You had to look at how effective, if you will, those youngsters were in getting their message across. And that healthy antinomianism was on display during the Occupy movement, was not new to the United States. We saw similar energies at work during the women's liberation movement, during the civil rights movement that dominated the last half of the 20th century, and an LGBTQ rights movement that ushered in the 21st century. So while the energy, the skepticism of constituted authority and activist spirit that undergirded these movements was not new, the reliance on social media was new. And internet technologies to recruit new activists was new. How would you train those activists? Those were new strategies. And how do you coordinate individual efforts in places like Tahrir Square? That was revolutionary. Disciplined indirection replaced marching orders, and broadly conceived goals replaced lists of demands. And manipulating the rules of engagement by way of coyness and brinksmanship replaced the traditional frontal assault. The Occupy movement reflected the vibrancy of a new and a very different blueprint for confronting power, and the Black Lives Matter movement took that up. As I said earlier, on July 13th, George Zimmerman was acquitted of all charges related to the shooting death of then 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. He just turned 17. He was 16. He just turned 17 a couple of weeks before he was killed. Anguished by the court's decision, social activist Alicia Garza posted what she called a love note to Black people. She posted that on Facebook with the phrase, "Our lives matter, Black lives matter." And Garza would then go on to partner with Patrisse Cullors and April Tometi to found the Black Lives Matter movement. Only slightly changing that blueprint that they took from the Occupy movement. So I want to talk a little bit about the four phases that I see in the development of the Black Lives Matter movement. You can see here some of the deaths that took place in 2013, 2014. The phase one of the Black Lives Matter movement was from Zimmerman's acquittal through Mike Brown's, the killing of Mike Brown in August of 2014. During that first phase in the Black Lives Matter movement, it took a while for them to get their sea legs, to figure out what they were going to do, how they were going to do it. The hashtag took on a life of its own. They started thinking about setting up, web pages and things like that, and still responding to deaths like Renisha McBride and Jordan Baker, and then of course Eric Garner's case came about. And Eric Garner's case set the stage for what was going to happen with Mike Brown. And in that second phase, which goes from actually November of November of 2014 instead of August, because it's in November that we find out that the police officer who shot Mike Brown was not going to be charged. That in that 2-year period, we saw the development of an ethos within Black Lives Matter, and it was punctuated by these losses, some of the ones that we remember most. And I always come back to Tamir Rice, who was just 12 years old when he was killed in November of 2014. And I remember President Obama, tearing up and says, "I always, But for me, Tamir Rice does for me what Sandy Hook did for President Obama. And in fact, it's hard for me to think through that young boy going to a park with a toy gun. When I was a kid, I had the same kind of toy pellet gun. And to think that within, a minute, that this young man had lost his life, that, and then senselessly so. Walter Scott's shooting in South Carolina, Freddie Gray, and then the loss of Sandra Bland, all of those kind of punctuated how painful this movement was and has been to the Black community. And I believe it's in that period that the Black community galvanized behind the Black Lives Matter movement. The major shift, however, in phase 2, and some people would argue that was the most important shift, or that this is the most important shift. It's when Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton arrived in Ferguson and were rebuked, were castigated for failing to march, for failing to be out there with the young people. And it was a painful transition to watch the old guard, leaders from the 1960s be told, "We don't want you here." It was also a moment when young people like Brittany Packnett and DeRay McKesson, that they emerged as the youthful leadership of this movement. One of the things that I note, and other folk have noted, this isn't a new observation, is that during the civil rights movement, the Black arts movement, there was a hyper focus on heterosexuality and the notion of Black alpha male leadership. In the Black Lives Matter movement, from its very origins, that position in the Black community was decentered. That women would lead in this movement, that people who were lesbian, gay, transgendered would also have leadership responsibilities within this movement. That separated this movement from other movements in African American cultural history in some really important ways. And I want to emphasize that, in the press, that rebuke was negative. It was seen as being disrespectful and the like. I mean, how do you tell Jesse Jackson, "Hey, Jesse, I haven't seen you marching. Are you just going to sit in the car all day?" But in the main, this was a very respectful transition from one generation to the next. And we also saw in that moment the rise of Black athletes like Colin Kaepernick, LeBron James, and other stars who came out and joined in these protests, some of them losing their livelihoods in the process. It was a moment that saw great momentum. And then something happened in the fall of, or actually in August of 2016. I was really fortunate while I was teaching Black Lives Matter, I had a graduate student here at the University of New Mexico who was a member of the call-in to the national call-ins for Black Lives Matter. And on occasion, he would come back and share information with me that he thought was relevant to my teaching. And in the summer of 2016, the young people who had been active organizing Black Lives Matter, a lot of them realized, hey, I have to go back to school in the fall. A lot of them were students. They hadn't earned money. They didn't have the kind of financial support that they needed. And they were looking at what they, and I think everyone thought would be an easy victory for Hillary Clinton against then candidate Donald Trump. And so what they decided, at least this is how it was reported to me from a member of that group, what they decided was to back off and not openly support Hillary Clinton, because they assumed that she would win. And once she got to that point where she was president of the United States, then they would have some leverage to come back to her and have an opportunity for greater change. And like almost everyone else in America who had no idea that Trump would actually be elected, they found themselves on a hiatus that lasted longer than they would have liked for it to. And so for that 2-year period between the presidential election in 2016 and the midterm election in 2018, there was another kind of regrouping and retooling within the Black Lives Matter movement. And once we got to the election in 2018, that the movement emerged again after the deaths of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, who were killed. Like one on the I believe Alton was killed on the 5th of July, and Philando Castile the next day on the 6th of July in 2016. That was a galvanizing moment for the movement. But instead of becoming more active, they went on this hiatus. From 2018 to the present, that period of reimagining what Black Lives Matter would do, gearing up for the presidential election, having a long-term focus rather than the short-term gains, the movement started to mature. And we saw the fruits of that vision, that maturity in this past election, where in Georgia, in Missouri, in Wisconsin, Black Lives Matter played a huge role in turning out the vote. And in Missouri, an openly Black Lives Matter activist was elected there. But there was a wake-up call also for the Democratic Party in the senatorial race in Wisconsin, when a young Black Republican was elected to the Senate based on a pro-life but also anti-Black Lives Matter campaign. I've gotten my notes that I need to wrap up, and there are a lot of other things that I'd like to share with you about this movement. As I said before, it's hard to do justice to this topic in a 45-minute presentation, but I hope that you get some sense of the kind of how the Black Lives Matter movement coalesced over that 7 years, and the energies that it drew from the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, and of course the great debt that movement has to the civil rights movement, to the Black Power movement. And my hope for the Black Lives Matter movement is that one, it continues to receive some support within communities of color, that it continues to expand and grow the base of that movement, and that when we look towards this next administration, assuming that we do have a new administration at some point soon, that the Black Lives Matter movement will have a strong say in what happens in our national politics going forward. I'm going to stop my presentation there, and we'll open the floor for additional comments. This is the Black Lives Matter timeline. I don't have time to go through that at this point. So 2018 to the present, this blue wave is one that I hope that they follow up on. You don't see Ahmaud Arbery here. Most of the shootings that I put up for you this afternoon have been police shootings and not vigilantism. I'm going to stop there, Sonia. It's an inelegant place to stop, but I'll stop there so that we don't run over time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. We appreciate you. We've gotten a couple of questions in, and please once again join me in thanking Dr. Finnie Coleman for his presentation, and we're going to move into Q&A. Our first question, Dr. Coleman, a hashtag has a lot of power to move people to action, such as hashtag Black Lives Matter. Can you talk about the origin, wisdom, persuasive power of hashtag slogans for movements? Specifically, can you address hashtag defund the police, pros and cons, and how it captures or doesn't capture the essence of the movement to hold police accountable?
Thank you for that question. It's true. I think what we see with social media is that social media is capturing something that's been hidden in plain sight, that the young people who are relying on technologies, they have built networks that move beyond the traditional networks and information sharing platforms that people in my generation are used to. I made the point actually literally yesterday during a lecture that, for my generation, when I talk about my good friends, my best friends, the people that I care about, I've been to their house. I know their kids, but my children, they have best friends that they will boo-hoo about, share all of their life secrets with, that they have never physically laid eyes on, that they met online, and they're friends with these people, like good, solid friends with them, and that's something that our generation is going to take a bit of time to fully understand and appreciate, that the current generation, the power behind what they're able to do is bound up in things like Black Twitter. Even I know people will say it's nonsense, but even in things like TikTok, platforms like TikTok, and if our generation is going to keep up, we're going to have to actually delve into those spaces and see what it is that our youth are into. And the hashtag for me is just a symbol of that much deeper dynamic in American society. As far as defund the police, I think the question is asking, I may be reading more into the question than it's being asked, but whether or not defunding the police is a good or bad thing. I think that's part of the question. And I think that we should put all options on the table. There are some places where we may seriously need to consider defunding the police. Other places where we need to move resources from one place to another, as we would do at any kitchen table around the country. Where do we make our best investment? How do we put resources on the table so that our police officers aren't asked to be, social workers and healthcare providers? That we put those people in place to do that work so that we don't overstress our police departments. So, I think it's a mistake to have a binary answer to the question of defunding or not defunding, right? That we need to have a more sophisticated and nuanced approach to defunding. I don't think defunding is going to become a movement in the way, say, Black Lives Matter has become a movement. But again, I'm not part of that youth community, and we'll see what they do with that. There are a lot of unknowns out there regarding defunding the police. We'll see where it goes.
Dr. Coleman, we've got a queue of questions. This is great. So one of our attendees says, small world, this person is from Pace, Florida, and worked in the courthouse the summer Robert Floyd was sentenced. How many phases do you think the Black Lives Matter movement will have? Do you feel as though it is a strong wave that is needed but not permanent? Or do you feel that it will be a staple similar to the NAACP?
I would have, if you had asked me that question in 2014, I'd have said, oh, it's going to be gone in the next news cycle. Had you asked me in 2015, I'd have given you the same reply. 16, the same reply. 17, the same reply. So you see where this goes. I don't think Black Lives Matter is going anywhere. And most of the people who think that it is going someplace, like I did, we've been wrong. I think with the maturity of that organization, you're going to see that decentralized energy taken up by our youth to try to affect change in America. Now, in fairness, as that movement matures, one of the things about not having centralized leadership is that it's tough to set a clear vision, if you will, for where the movement is going to go. Unfortunately, the vision is externally directed. And what I mean by that is, as long as there are police officers who are rogue and beat and kill young Black kids, as long as we have vigilantes like the ones in Brunswick, Georgia, there's going to be that energy. That energy has been there since the founding of our country. And it takes me back to that notion of a racial contract as opposed to a social contract as a founding principle for our democracy. Short of a revolution, the best that we can hope for is an asymptotic approach to the democracy that we imagined when this country first started. And Black Lives Matter, to me, seems to be that force within the Black community that is going to nudge this country in that direction, independent of how the country feels about that. And as long as our country resists that movement, I think you're going to have Black Lives Matter. And even if you don't have Black Lives Matter, you're going to have something else. Remember that the Tea Party, the energy for the Tea Party is traced back to the 1948 election when the Dixiecrats, felt that, the Democratic Party was becoming too liberal. And by 1968, that movement, that group of folk have come into the Republican Party, and then into the moral majority, and then through the Reagan administration, Bush administrations, up to the Tea Party, and what you're seeing with these Trump supporters. That energy goes directly back to 1948. What I believe is the energy that you're seeing in the Black Lives Matter movement traces itself back to literally people like Denmark Vesey. It's energy that's rooted in Nat Turner. That resistance to injustice in America. So as long as there's injustice in America, you're going to have Black Lives Matter. And if you don't have Black Lives Matter, you're going to have something like it.
Dr. Coleman, you stated that Black Lives Matter has lost popularity with whites. Do you see strategies to increase white support of issues of Black Lives Matter? Can you provide and can you also provide an effective response to, quote, all lives matter?
Oh, wow. So let me start with the all lives matter, because that presumes something, a rhetorical stance from Black Lives Matter that is part of what we saw with Ron Paul, the ascribing to Black Lives something that it never said. Black Lives Matter never said that only Black Lives Matter, that Black Lives Matter is the most important thing. The point was simply this: you can be on a city block and all of the houses matter on that city block. But if one of the houses is on fire, at that moment, that house matters more to the police department, to the fire department, than the other houses do. Now, they want to protect the other houses for sure, right? But in that moment, when that house is on fire, that's where you focus your attention. And while all lives matter, I don't see elderly white women being shot by police. at the rate that young Black men and women are. I don't see elderly white men being crushed on the floor with people's knees in the backs of their throats. There is a callousness to all lives matter, and that goes along the lines of the rhetoric of reverse racism. Oh, reverse racism. What that means is you're doing the same thing that I'm doing, just in reverse, ignoring the power dynamics that make that so untrue. I think the same thing is true with all lives matter. All lives matter is of course true, but it does not in any way conflict or confound what Black Lives Matter is trying to do. So with that said, I'll try to see if I can remember all of the first part of the question. Help me, Sonia, with the first part.
What are some strategies to increase white support of
Well,
Black Lives Matter?
I think the strategies have always been the same strategies. And if you've heard me talk before about Black Lives Matter, then you'll know one of the things that I come back to when I get asked this question almost every time is listen, actually hear what your young people, what they've been saying. And rather than, because I hear this as, what can I do now? What is it that I can do? And most of us remain absolutely uneducated about hegemonic masculinity, absolutely uneducated about the impact of white supremacy and its genesis. We don't possess the critical vocabulary broadly enough in America to have the kinds of conversations about race and difference that we need to have. So before we can start looking to have an increase in the number of white people who support, I say that we also have to work on our cross-cultural literacy. What is it that we need to learn so that we can participate in these conversations in a meaningful way and not just assuage our guilt by going out and standing in line and marching? That isn't going to get it done. The marches are symbols of the work that need to be done behind the scenes, right? And so that's where I would hope people who find themselves on the outside of this movement looking in and they want to participate, begin with yourself, just as Malcolm taught us so many decades ago. Begin with yourself, educate yourself about what it is that you want to participate in, and then participate in it because you've done the work, not because you've been invited, not because someone has given you permission, but because you've done the hard work that it takes to come into a movement and being able to offer something that's value added there. So I know that's kind of didactic.
No, we've got a couple more that I think you'll really enjoy thinking about as a group. Would you please discuss your impressions on how Black Lives Matter may have influenced or seized the energy of the toppling of the monuments in Richmond, Virginia, with the changing leadership at VMI to have its first Black leader? I knew you'd like this question.
Well, you may know that I graduated from VMI, and I've written a piece for the Washington Post. We'll see if they publish it. They seem to want to have a hatchet job on VMI. I would point out that when we go into this discussion, and we're going to eventually get to the place where we're healing again as a nation, right? Where we're trying to grow and become the nation that we want. And the epicenter of that's going to be a place like Lexington, Virginia, where the Virginia military is located. And the statues on post there, the one statue that's being removed is Stonewall Jackson, Confederate general. When I was a cadet, I'd come out, have to salute his butt every day before I went to class as a rat. And frankly, as a rat, I wasn't sophisticated enough to think beyond, well, that's what I have to do because I'm here, I'm a rat, right? And I never thought about it in terms of protest. But I think when we make these decisions to remove these monuments, and I get this will not be a popular position, but I want to assure you it's not rooted in any support or loyalty that I have to VMI. I have that loyalty, I have that support for VMI, but that's not where this is coming from. There are 3 statues on that campus, actually 4, that we need to talk about in terms of a principled decision in moving those monuments. Yeah, we move Stonewall Jackson. I don't care where you move him, get rid of him. But you then have George Marshall, who was a 4-star general, right? And Francis Heney Smith, who held slaves, he held more slaves than Stonewall Jackson. So I think you should move him just as much as you would move Stonewall Jackson, because we can't be selective about why it is that we're moving these monuments. If we want to remove people who held slaves, then I think we should do that. They should not be revered. But on VMI's campus, there's also on around the corner from Stonewall Jackson, a statue of George Washington. And he owned hundreds of slaves. I think you should remove him too. So it means if we're going to have a principle about this, it can't be simply that we want to remove we want to interrogate part of our history. We have to interrogate the entirety of our history, which means looking honestly at our founding fathers and the racial contract that they subscribed our nation to, that we've never had the courage to revolt against.
Dr. Coleman,
at that moment.
We've got a couple more questions and a couple of minutes. So let's,
okay.
I'll do these a little bit out of order, but I'd like you to speak briefly to the percent of the Black women killed that were transgendered.
Oh my, yeah. Oh wow. Let me start by saying it is an embarrassment that we have not paid attention to the number of trans women who have been murdered, especially in places like New Orleans. If this were happening to any other group in America, at the rates that it's happening and as widespread as it's happening, there'd be a hue and cry against it, right? Those percentages reflect a dark underbelly, not just in America, in white America. It reflects an underbelly across American society. This homophobia intersecting with misogyny and the violence that comes of that moment. We just haven't done the work. I need to do more work myself. I would like to teach about that, but I'm not prepared to do it yet. I still need to learn more and study more so that I have greater possession of the knowledge base there. But this is something that is not new. I want to reemphasize that too. Trans men and women, this has been a horrible scourge in the Black community since the 1960s, 70s, and actually before, but 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into our moment. I could say more. If you've seen, I would encourage all of you, if you haven't watched a show called Pose, take my advice. If you're interested in this as an issue, watch that show and you will get some sense of the depth of this issue in the Black community.
Dr. Coleman, we are nearing the end of time, but one of our last questions is, how do we take a class with you?
Well, you can take a class. You probably know, I have a group of people from the community who take my classes each semester. It's really nice when I'm teaching a freshman class to have 10 or 15, folk from the community who are interested in and participating in that, and then have some set of those be retirees. It's a really interesting dynamic. You can reach out to me individually on that. You can contact the English department about my courses. In the spring, I'm going to teach a novels course. But I also do, in the community, I do reading groups for interested groups. So if there's a group of people who want a specialized course, an independent study, I'm always happy to do those as well. So,
and with your permission, because I'm sure many people are wondering about this, I'm just going to share my screen. Oops, not share too much. But you should note that Dr. Coleman and Dr. Powers will be part of a community racial contract lecture series. The Racial Contract Lecture Series, this is available through the New Mexico Black Leadership Council. This will be a 3-part series. And Dr. Coleman, which day are you speaking?
I'm the first day. I'm on day 1.
So I will make sure that this link is made available to all of our attendees, but this is a great opportunity for people to hear from Dr. Finnie Coleman, Dr. Nancy Lopez, and Dr. Kathy Powers. And Asia, we're prepared to turn it back over to you. Thank you, Dr. Coleman.
Thank you.
So I just want to thank Dr. Coleman and Dr. Powers for their presentations. This was a great way to kick off our first day of our 3-day series. I've learned a lot. I'm hoping that our participants have learned a lot. So thank you for hanging in there with us. I know we're a little bit over time, but I do just want to say, first of all, sorry about the background noise. My little 1-year-old is going crazy in there. But we do want to say happy 88th birthday to one of our founding members of the organization, Mrs. Hannah Best. 88 years of doing the good work. And she was one of the founding members along with Raymond Hamilton and Tommy Jewell, who founded our organization in 1982, the New Mexico Black Lawyers Association. So we want to say very happy birthday to her. Also, I just want to remind people, if you do need CLE credit, email us with your bar number and your name to nmblacklawyers with an S @gmail.com. I also want to remind everyone who's on for our 3 days or even 2 days, if you're on tomorrow, please do not use the Eventbrite link. Those emails are automatic, so we cannot cancel them. But the link to join will not be an Eventbrite link. It will be the link that you get from the New Mexico Black Lawyers Gmail account, and it will be a Zoom link. So please use the Zoom link sent to you via New Mexico Black Lawyers and not the Eventbrite link. The Eventbrite link will not work. And also just remember that you won't be able to use the same link that you used today. The other links are in the emails. And so if you do not see those other links, you will have separate links for each day. Please let us know by emailing us at nmblacklawyers@gmail.com. And with that, I just want to thank you for joining us. I hope that you're joining us tomorrow and on Friday. We have some really great presentations. And thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time.